Hi, welcome back to the Healing Grief, Healing Trauma Summit. I'm Stephen Berkeley, and I'm here with the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Helané, Wahbeh. Dr. Wahbeh is an assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Science University, and she is a board member and past president of the Parapsychological Association. Dr. Wahbeh obtained her clinical doctorate at the National University of Natural Medicine, and our Master of Clinical Research from Oregon Health and Science University. Dr. Wahbeh has published and spoken internationally about her studies on complementary and alternative medicine, mind-body medicine, extended human capacities, stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, and their relationships to physiology, health, and healing. Dr. Wahbeh is the author of The Science of Channeling: Why You Should Trust Your Intuition and the Force That Connects Us All. Dr. Wahbeh, it's wonderful to be with you here today. Hi.
Hello. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Stephen. It's great to be here with you.
Fantastic. The Institute of Noetic Sciences, or IONS for short, that studies consciousness. What do we know about consciousness? And more to the point, what can we say is either confirmed or likely about our existence beyond this physical realm we're living in?
That's a wonderful question and a great one to unpack. So if you had, 20 people in a room and you asked each of them, what is consciousness? You'd probably end up with 20 different answers. And so that word in and of itself is really rife with issues. The way we like to think about it at IONS is big C consciousness and little c consciousness. So little c consciousness is I'm awake, I'm aware. This is what most neuroscientists are focused on. And there is the materialist paradigm kind of holds that consciousness is actually an emergent property of our brain, of our neurons, and that it's encased in our skull. That's where it lives, that's where it stays, and it's a very physicalist, materialist worldview. And there's some incredible efforts right now attempting to figure out how our neurons create consciousness. Well, there's also a totally different camp, which we call big C consciousness, and there's growing evidence for this, that our consciousness, our awareness is actually not an emergent property of the brain, is something beyond the brain and can extend through time and space and beyond time and space. And relevant to this symposium, that it exists beyond the death of our physical body, that it's not limited to our physical body. And so there's numerous bodies of evidence that are kind of supporting this hypothesis. And there are more and more people who are interested in this idea that consciousness is actually the fundamental nature of reality rather than the material.
So what would you say is the most probative piece of evidence that you've come across regarding the continuation of our consciousness post-death?
I think that it is not just one area, but when you look at all the areas together. For example, there is quite a bit of research on terminal lucidity, which is this interesting phenomenon where someone may be on their deathbed from very severe dementia. They have CAT scans that have shown that their brain is completely atrophied. They haven't been able to speak or, have move their body in any way. And for all intents purposes, their brain is not functional. And then all of a sudden they sit up in bed, they start having complete coherent conversations with their family members. And then within a day or two, they pass on. And so people can't explain what's going on here because the brain is mush. How could it actually be sitting up, having these conversations, etc.? So that's one really fun area. Another exciting area is around out-of-body experiences. And this is where people have the experience of their consciousness not being tethered to their body and actually moving around in space. And there's numerous verified cases of people who have, let's say, heard what the surgeon was saying, or, there's this fantastic case of someone saw a red shoe on the roof of the hospital during their surgery. And it's like, how do we explain that? We can't explain that without envisioning that our consciousness can be aware outside of our body.
You mentioned when you were interviewed by Rick Archer in the Food at the Gas Pump show, you mentioned a specific study regarding OBEs, out-of-body experiences, and a study that was replicable, one where people were taught or hypnotized. Now, this program I saw you on was 2 years ago, so I'm assuming that actually happened. Did that happen, that study?
So I'm thinking of two different studies around that topic. So I had shared with Rick, I believe, about a protocol that we did using hypnosis to put people into a very relaxed, safe place and be able to experience an out-of-body experience. And so we have done a few cases on that, although COVID kind of messed up our research labs' ability to do studies in person. But we're actually coming back to that study right now and writing it up. And the out-of-body experience was a precursor to learning how to do something called trance channeling, which is this experience of feeling like your body is being used as a vehicle for a supposed non-physical being to speak through you. And so that's another interesting topic. But back to the out-of-body experiences, maybe that's the study you were speaking of.
Yes. But I'll switch gears back to telepathy, because I think more people are probably interested in this particular topic in this particular summit. So telepathy, what can we say that science, conventional science, if you will, supports?
So conventional science will say that telepathy is impossible because our consciousness is limited to the brain. So, from that materialist perspective, there's no mechanism that could describe how that would happen. Now, that's, completely contrary to the thousands of, maybe even millions of anecdotes that people have experienced receiving mental impressions from other people spontaneously, whether it's, knowing that cousin Susie had an accident when she lives, across the country, or, parent-child, knowing what's happening with your child, even though there was no way you could possibly know, to in laboratory studies where they actually have people in the laboratory attempt to notice an image that the researcher is presenting in a different room. And this has been done while people are asleep and also while people were awake, and in multiple labs all around the world. And there have been positive findings. In fact, there's a multi-site international study that we're about to start right now. IONS is one of the sites, repeating one of these protocols called the Ganzfeld. And the Ganzfeld is unique because there's a theory that if we reduce our external sensory input, that it's easier to get telepathic mental impressions. And so the Ganzfeld has some of the best results in the parapsychology literature. And so this is a replication of sorts. we can get into the nuances of whether it's really a mental impression that we're receiving in real time, or whether it's knowing the future. Because at some point, you'll see that image. And so maybe you're actually just tapping into your future rather than getting that mental impression.
Wow. Okay. So we're kind of getting a little bit more sci-fi, but it's not sci-fi. It's really happening. But let me go back to telepathy. And I was having a conversation with Eben Alexander about something. Eben Alexander, for those of you who don't know, uh, is a neurologist, neuroscientist, or neurosurgeon, I should say. He fell into a coma and he had a very active experience while his brain was, at least theoretically, or actually clinically dead or dying. He had a 2% chance of recovery, and he had a very vivid experience. But how could that be? If his brain was dying, how could that be? So the question I had for him was, well, how do you know? How do you know that this was a real experience? And after he gave me his explanation actually is grounded in science. But the question is, when we're talking about science supporting something like telepathy, science, you spoke of an accumulation, really. It's not just one experiment you're going to point to, it's an accumulation. But what is if it's an overwhelming amount of evidence, does that mean the way that what we think about the scientific method, what we think of tweaking that, will it somehow capture qualitative results? Will we change the way we measure things going forward? If this is real, and we want conventional science to recognize it as real, will we change our measuring sticks?
That's a wonderful question. And I think people have a very interesting perspective of what science is. But science is a process that starts with a specific research question. And so the way you design a study is based on your specific research question and what you're trying to understand. Now, people in hard science might say, oh, well, qualitative, soft social sciences are not really science. But from my perspective, they are, because you can still develop a research question and develop a study design to answer it, which includes both quantitative and qualitative. And it really depends on what your question is. And so at IONS, we attempt to include the subjective phenomenological aspect of the experience, because there's such incredible richness there that you lose if you're just sticking to the objective measures. And that doesn't mean we throw away the objective measures, because we really appreciate those as well. But ideally, you would include both, and they would support each other in terms of what you're seeing about the question you're trying to answer.
So if I'm having a debate with somebody about whether consciousness survives our bodily death, is there a particular study that I could reference? I always want to have a study in my back pocket to produce if I get into a discussion like this. Is there one that you like?
Until a few years ago, I would have to point to the 150 years of parapsychological research that has addressed this. A few years ago, the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies did a contest, and they asked people to submit essays of the best evidence of survival of consciousness. And so that is an incredible, wonderful resource. And BICS, which is the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies, actually created books that they passed out all over the world, collating all these essays in one place. And if you read all of them, I haven't read all of them, but I've read many of them. IONS was one of the honorable mention winners for that. They're really pulling from similar bodies of evidence, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, mental mediumship, physical mediumship, reincarnation, terminal lucidity. And when you look at all of those together, it's a nice big mountain of evidence. And so some people who want hard, definitive proof, I don't think we can say that we have hard, definitive proof, because there's always the alternate explanation that someone can come up with for each one of those cases, right? Mm-hmm. And so maybe we won't definitively know in this hard, like proof way until we actually die ourselves, right? And then it'll be like, oh, of course, you know? And yet I think with the tools that we have today, our ability to definitively prove that is limited. But I feel hopeful that in the future, we will be able to do that. For example, let's envision that I'm in my lab, and for whatever reason, spirits can actually physically materialize, and I could have a conversation with them, and we could, document that and have witnesses and do that over and over again, and multiple labs could do that over and over again. That would be pretty strong definitive proof, if you could rule out fraud and all these other explanations. And so right now, like after Bix is now like, there's enough proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And so that's good enough for us. We're not going to try to prove it anymore. We're just moving on and assuming that it's true. And so what do we do with that? And so, people's beliefs are kind of on a spectrum, and it kind of depends who you're talking to and their worldview and their level of belief in terms of how willing they are to accept that as a potential future when our physical body dies.
Very good. So based on everything you've studied and researched and experienced yourself, do you think that we all possess the ability to connect telepathically to our deceased loved ones?
I personally do. That is my worldview, my belief system. And so as the director of research, I have my scientist hat on, and then I have my personal experience channeler hat on. And so I can, in full transparency, say to you that my worldview includes life after death, includes consciousness surviving. Consciousness is fundamental, being able to dialogue with our deceased loved ones. And just like your previous question, you said, well, has it been proven? Well, with my scientist hat, I can say, no, I don't think it has been, but there's a lot of evidence for it. So I get to play these two roles, if you will, in terms of what I'm sharing with you.
Mm-hmm. Now, essentially, you are applying science to spirituality. Now, how do you maintain like scientific rigor when exploring these esoteric areas of consciousness?
So before I answer that, I want to go back to your previous question, because I don't think I answered the core of your question, which is at IONS, we're kind of holding this hypothesis that everybody has the ability, just an innate ability to access information and energy from beyond time and space. And that could include communication with loved ones. And so I really think it is an exploration of our own intuitive capacities, learning how that uniquely shows up for each person. And if they want to learn to do it themselves, then they can set that intention and develop it. And of course, there are numerous exceptional mediums who act as translators, if you will, or believe that they do from the other side. And so they can also experience that for themselves.
I've noticed a big change in the whole mediumship community, that mediums are not just offering their mediumship services, but they're offering to teach. It seems to be a big movement across the board, at least in my world, Now, I'm assuming that's a product of the paradigm shift that we seem to be moving towards. Would you agree with that?
I would. And I I don't want I'm just going to use this as an example, even though it's not a great example. I mean, you look at the church and this, top down spirituality of, the church has to be this vehicle through which you can connect to the divine, right? And that's shifted quite dramatically. I mean, there's numerous spiritual communities that are like, no, you can go God direct on your own. You don't need to have this translator, this mediator. You are divine. You can connect with the divine yourself. And a similar thing I think is happening with mediumship, not to compare mediumship to the church, but the mediums were acting as this mediator, right? And so they're being guided to not necessarily be the mediator anymore. I'm not, as the medium saying, I'm not better than you. Like, you too can actually connect in this way. So yes, I absolutely see that. And I think it's really important for everyone to feel empowered in that way and to not project their authority outside of themselves and really own their own intuitive capacity, so that to support them in their life, not just with communicating with deceased loved ones, but just being able to tune in to what is in their highest and best in their own life, with daily decisions and what they're doing with their work and family, etc.
So I'm guessing, in terms of if you were going to address a group of people who were bereaved, you would say first and foremost, especially if people are somewhat uncertain as to what to do about afterlife communication, you would probably suggest first read the research. Read some essays that were submitted to the Bigelow contest. And then it sounds like it's a very individual, though, choice in terms of how to connect, because there are multiple ways of connecting, but it's depending on who you are and what your own level of sensitivity is or something along those lines. It's going to be different for everyone, or is there a particular method that you would suggest first?
That's a great question. I have multiple thoughts on that, and they may be a little controversial.
I want to hear them all.
Okay. I feel that connecting with our deceased loved ones is a gift and yet can be a block to the natural grieving process. And so, I know loss can be deeply, deeply painful and debilitating. And the grief process is so intense and can last a long time. And so, first and foremost, I think it's essential for bereaved to take ownership of their grieving process and receive support for as best they can to clear the emotion and the layers of grief, and to, as best they can, let the person go, because they are in different planes, and the development of the deceased person and the person still on earth needs to have that disconnection at some level so that they can both grow and shift and evolve and respond to the new environment. All that being said, once we are kind of more balanced and accepting, doesn't mean the grief is gone or the sadness is gone, etc. From this balanced place, I think is a much more grounded, healthful place to begin the practice of communicating with a deceased loved one, because it's not coming from a place of lack or pathology or deep woundedness. It's coming from a place of a desire for connection and love. And this is just my personal thoughts on this, which is what you asked, right? And so setting the intention to connect with the loved one, I think is incredibly powerful. And perhaps connecting with a skilled medium or psychic could support someone in the beginning. And now there's these incredible studies done by Julie Beischel and colleagues who have actually shown that it really has helped the grieving process. So you mentioned the multiple ways that people can engage in this, and I think that's true. And so I would invite the listeners to kind of, maybe write them all out and get still and quiet and say, okay, which one would be the best for me? Which aligns with my own intuitive capacities, my own kind of expression of being able to do this? And then it can unfold from there.
Very good. So you did mention Julie Beischel, who actually influenced me quite a bit in the making of the film, Life with Ghosts. And in that film, what's featured is a study by Jan Holden at the University of North Texas, where it's pretty much proven that connecting to your deceased loved ones is substantially healing, much more so than traditional grief counseling. So that was great to be able to like have that in the film and have people be able to look at something that says, okay, this has been proven to work. So we know that's true. But let me ask you this. You said earlier about we need to disconnect first and foremost. Now, I'm assuming that you mean we need to disconnect to the physical person, but we never need to disconnect to our emotional bond. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. So it's interesting. I did watch your film, which was incredible. And, you see how near the end, am I allowed to talk about it?
Oh, of course. As a matter of fact, I insist upon that.
So the wife at the end, she realizes that by holding on to her grief, she's actually, blocking her life essentially. And that once she moves through that emotion and really accepts that he's gone, she's actually able to be in a better heartfelt connection with her husband. Anyway, it's quite profound. So, I do feel that mediumship and connecting with the loved one can absolutely support the grief process. And what I was speaking to about this disconnection is it can become like a crutch that can block someone's healing process as well. Because if they, this is so nuanced and we could talk for like many, many more hours about this, but there is a acceptance that that physical person is gone and that the relationship has shifted that allows people to actually complete their grieving process more easily. And so if they're stuck on, oh, I'm going to talk to the medium every day and, I'm going to keep connecting, and then it can become a crutch. Am I making any sense?
You certainly are. And that's become a bit of an issue in terms of my own conversations with people, because there have been mediums I've spoken to, and I ended up interviewing lots of mediums for the film, thinking that the film was going to feature a lot of mediums because they're always working with people who are on the other realm. It didn't turn out that way, but I got a lot of interesting information. One piece of information is that at least half the mediums I spoke to might counsel people not to continue visiting them because that's another way of being stuck. They're just there are other mediums or other factions, I should say, they're more like, hey, you can hold on to your loved one forever. There's no reason not to. They're here. They're right here. We just can't see them, but they're right next to us. So I'm trying to figure out myself what I believe is the right thing. I think it's probably different for each person, as you were saying earlier. Everybody's individuals, and some people are going to get stuck if they continue visiting mediums, they're now living with one foot in the another realm. And there are just as many people will be like, well, that's great. I get to be in two realms at once. So you personally would not recommend, I'm guessing, that people visit mediums more than a couple of times and then they get the answers they need to live the rest of their lives, but they don't have to continue that relationship.
Um, like you said, I think it depends on the person and where they're at. I can speak from my own experience. And
Please do.
this is Helané as person and as channeler. Okay. I my father just passed last year
Oh, I'm sorry.
of dementia. And we were very close. He was so, so dear to me. And I knew he was passing for a long time, so it wasn't a surprise, and I was working through my emotions and grief around it. And so when he finally passed, there was a period of time when I was just emoting and crying and sad and, just feeling the loss of my father, not just my father who was ill, but my father through my whole life from a child and, remembering the memories and clearing that out. And because I'm a trance channeler and I have trance channelers in my family, after a while, I was able to actually have a session where I believe I communicated with my father. And I was like, how's it going? How are you doing? What's it like? How was your death? Like, because I had my own feelings about exactly how it happened. And it was very, very deeply healing for me to have that conversation. But I wasn't in a place where I was like, I want you back. And it's not okay for you to be where you are. It was just like a connection conversation. And so that happened twice in that way. And in my daily life, I may, think of him and focus on my heart and envision him. And then I just feel him holding me, and then we let each other go, And so it's not like, and maybe it's different with a child and a parent or with a loved one who was your life partner and so close. I don't know if that's helpful for people to hear, but I know that, if I think of him and am in my heart place, I can instantly connect with his energy. And yet I also know from my own belief system and worldview that he's not just standing there waiting for me to think about him. He's doing his own thing. He has this whole life on the other side, is growing and learning and shifting. And I don't want to block that by always calling on him, I don't know. And again, I'm just transparently sharing my personal experience with this. So do I think it's wrong to go to a medium? Absolutely not. Do I think it's probably not helpful to go like every day, multiple times a day in a way that kind of blocks your own growth in life and maybe even blocks your loved one because they keep being pulled back to the earthly plane when they need to, not need to, but they may thrive by not being so stuck to the earth and shifting and morphing themselves.
I think a lot of people who are listening to this right now are saying to themselves, finally, a scientist is saying it's okay to go to a medium or to connect telepathically myself. People have been waiting for people who have scientific backgrounds to give them permission. Would you, in terms of getting started to try to connect telepathically, if you've gone to the medium, you've gotten information, now you want to do something along the lines of mediumship all by yourself, what would you recommend? Like, how could if somebody's a beginning channeler, what's the first step to become a channeler?
That's a great question. I actually just finished teaching a whole course with the Shift Network called Best Practices of Channeling. And I think one of the strongest predictors is believing that you can, believing that you can. And another strong one is having a meditative practice. And so you could think of that as step one. And, whether it's my course or some other intuitive capacity course, I would explore any that you resonate with and start, set the intention that you want to develop your own intuitive capacities in general, which will then support you to connect with your loved one. And we have this really cool inventory called the Noetic Signature Inventory, which you can take on our website, which basically shows you where you're strong with your channeling expression. So are you very physical? Do you feel it in your body? Do you hear messages? Do you see things? And that can be really enlightening for people just starting out, because it gives them kind of a gauge of where they're at. Because let's say someone's really visceral, then they, instead of like waiting to hear a voice in their head, it's like, oh, I actually need to check in with my gut. Is my gut feeling expanded or contracted? Just as an example. Or seeing visuals versus not, or getting goosebumps versus not. And, it was really wonderful to see the grandmother in your film with the automatic writing, because is it another really great tool, but not everybody resonates with that. But some do. And so that's another really fun way to get in it, especially if you use your non-dominant hand. And you just write with your non-dominant hand. That's another really fun way to get into it.
That's a good tip. Now, could you just describe or explain why the non-dominant hand might be advantageous to use?
Because our ego mind, especially in the West, is very strong. And so it's much easier to let go of your kind of cognitive intellect if you're writing with your non-dominant hand than your dominant hand. And some people, if they're incredible typists, they can actually sit at a computer keyboard with their eyes closed and just see what happens when their fingers start moving. But, automatic writing is a form of trance channeling. And so not everybody's going to resonate with that. And it's not going to work for everybody very easily. So I would only go there if that like lights you up in some way of like, ooh, I want to try that, or I want to do that. But it's not the only way. There's so many other ways to tap in with your intuition. And, as I'm teaching, one thing that comes up over and over again is doubt. People just doubt themselves. They doubt what they're experiencing. They have very prescribed, views about what it's supposed to look like. And then it doesn't look like that. And then they beat themselves up because it's like, oh, well, I didn't hear the voice. It's like, you might not hear a voice. It may, show up totally differently. And that's okay, to really honor and nurture however our intuition shows up.
Now, you wrote a whole book on this topic.
Yes.
Now, here's my question for you. You answered it partially just now, but I have a very hard time separating intuition from worrying. How do I know I'm just not worrying about something?
Well, worry is laden with fear and anxiety. And so, if you're feeling fearful or anxious, that's not your intuition.
What if I'm intuiting something scary?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you're like predicting something in the future that you're afraid of.
Yeah, I'm just, I guess I have that doubt that you just spoke of. So I'm feeling like I'm getting something. I just don't know if it's intuition or if it's something that I'm just ruminating. I want to be able to separate me from the signals that I'm getting from somewhere else.
Got it. Yes. So I invite people to always start with yes, no questions, very binary, no open ended, what's my future hold? I mean, that's just kind of setting us up for failure, really. But beginning with very clear yes, no questions about benign daily things. Oh, is this type of pasta better for me than this one? I mean, just no, like, should I leave my husband or should I move to Alaska questions when you're first starting out? It's just very basic. And then if you practice that daily or, as often as you can, even if it's just 5 minutes a day, you become attuned to the signals that you're receiving. What does a yes feel like? What does a no feel like? And then you repeat, you repeat, you repeat. And ideally, you could ask yes, no questions that are actually actionable. Because if you get a yes, and then you move forward with that, and then that leads to increased energy, increased joy, increased quality of life, opportunities show up, synergy, synchronicities show up with that yes. You're like, oh, that was my intuition guiding me in the right way. If you take action and you're beating your head against the wall and it's not working and it doesn't feel good and you're angry and frustrated and annoyed, that was probably your ego mind giving you the answer. And then we bring the attitude of love and kindness through this process, and you just repeat it over and over and over again. It's like building a muscle. You have to go to the intuition gym and learn how to work out.
Definitely. Um, Very good. So let me ask you this. Now, we're talking about the evidence of the continuation of consciousness as being very compelling, overwhelming. So, what do you think has to happen in our world for that balance to tip in favor of a post-material world?
Um, that's a great question. And it's also a very Western centric question because this is a Western paradigm that our consciousness is in our brain. And there's so many peoples and cultures around the world that just are like, whatever, like, get over yourselves. Of course, it goes beyond. Of course, I survived my physical death. And so when people ask me questions like that, I think, well, who are we trying to convince? you know? And does it really matter? Because you have belief along this whole spectrum, people who are just complete believers and they don't care about the science because they've had their personal experience and they just know it's true, right? Then you have the people, the diehard skeptics on the other side who are so entrenched in their worldview that no matter how much evidence to the contrary you would show them, they would still never change their mind. I have no time or energy for them because there's nothing I can show them that would persuade them, right? So it really is the people in the middle who are open, who are curious, who are willing to learn. Maybe you call it healthy skepticism. You show them the evidence, you give them direct experience of their consciousness outside their body. Like we have this huge psychedelic renaissance right now. We have, all these classes on mediumship and remote viewing and telepathy and out of body experiences. Like you could take any one of those classes for the next, 10 years and learn all of these skills practically to, have your consciousness be outside your body. I don't want to preach to the choir, but I also don't want to try to convince the skeptics. And by continuing to balance the science with the direct experience, I think we're going to make a big shift. And it's shifting already. I mean, it's so vastly different today than it was, 8 or so years ago when I started at Ions. I mean, the momentum is just building and building and building. And the materialist paradigm for consciousness, it's just falling apart.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think hopefully we'll get more academics to agree with you.
Yeah.
They seem to be the last holdout.
Yes. It's shifting. I mean, we'll talk again, Stephen, in about 5 years, and it's going to be completely different.
Yeah.
That's my prediction.
It's already in the ether, so you're just gonna
Yes.
have to wait for it. So
Yes.
I know part of this day that we're talking on is going to be involving near-death experiences. So I really want to address that before we have to leave. And near-death experiences, the specific question I have for you about is this. Do near-death experiences provide evidence for life after death? Aren't such experiences subjective?
They are subjective. And what's fascinating about them, if you look at, the thousands of cases that have been collected, is that they have very common themes. And it's like, okay, well, if it's a subjective reality, then why do they all seem so similar? And I think some of the most compelling near death experiences are ones where they also include out of body perspectives that can be verified. Those are really quite exciting and compelling when you get verifiable information that the person perceived when they were dead. It's like, okay, how does that happen? So yeah, that's my answer for that.
So there's my favorite new word in my vocabulary is veridical. So I bet you could help the audience know what veridical evidence means because I love what it means. Tell us what it means.
Yes. So let's say, someone is declared clinically dead, okay? And they're been dead for hours or days even. And their consciousness is still perceiving, and they perceive something like the red shoe at the top of the hospital. And then when they are somehow revived and come back to life, their physical body comes back to life. And then they report to people, hey, I saw this red shoe at the top of the hospital when I was out. There is no way that they could have known that there was a red shoe at the top of the hospital without perceiving it somehow. And so that is an example of a veridical, subjective, experience.
So the experience can be verified by something outside.
Yes. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. So then they go and they're like, oh, yeah, there's this weird red shoe up here by the air conditioner. And no one knew that it was there. And yeah.
Great. Thank you. So we're getting close to the end of the hour now. So I think it's important that we make sure that whatever final takeaways that the audience should have from this session, maybe we could just like reiterate now. What do we got? What are the takeaways? What do you want to make sure that the audience takes away from this?
That you are loved, that you are not alone, that you are deeply, deeply supported on the physical and non-physical realms, and to take heart and bring kindness and compassion to yourself and to others, and know that you are a magnificent, empowered being, and just tap into that next beautiful step for you.
That was beautiful. Thank you. I love that.
You're welcome.
How can people learn more about you and your work?
The best place to learn about ions is our website, noetic.org, noetic.org. We have all our published papers and webinars, free webinars on Friday. We have our participate in research studies and wonderful blogs that translate our science into general accessible language that I think anybody can understand. So please join our community. We'd love to share about the work that we do.
Fantastic. Dr. Wahbeh, thank you so much for your time today. I feel like I learned some things. That was
Wonderful.
great.
I'm so glad.
So we're going to say goodbye for now, and we're going to just wait for the next session. But thank you so much.